Welcome to the faculty, the staff, the students, the board members who are on, and the community members who are on. This is a very special day. For those of you whom I have not met, I'm President Lieberman. I serve the University of La Verne, and I am deeply, deeply honored to be asked to introduce our Frederick Douglass Lecture keynote address. If you don't know, the University of La Verne Frederick Douglass Lecture Series was created to honor the renowned 19th century author and orator, Frederick Douglass. His lectures, his research, and his impact have had tremendous influence throughout our country. In honoring Frederick Douglass through this annual lecture series, we do this to bring to our campus community change makers, intellectuals, social justice advocates, scholars, and visionaries. And today, you are going to be able to spend the next hour with a person who is exactly that, a community and equal rights and social justice advocate, an intellectual, a scholar, a visionary, and in higher education, one of the greatest change makers we and I have ever known. So today, our Frederick Douglass keynote speaker is the incomparable Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, and I am deeply, profoundly honored to be asked to introduce her to you. Dr. Tatum is President Emerita of Spelman College, where she served for 13 years, from 2002 to 2015. Her presidency was marked by innovation and growth, and her visionary leadership was recognized in so many ways across the country in so many different venues. And one in particular, in 2013, she received the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. I've seen her in so many occasions when she's received awards, always humble, always brilliant, and always gracious. She's authored numerous books, including the best-selling Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Other Conversations About Race, Can We Talk About Race? And Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation. Dr. Tatum's approach to leadership and change permeates her personal life and her professional friendships. Over the years, I can tell you I have been fortunate to observe Dr. Tatum as a president and as a national change maker. She brings a combination of grace and strength to every single interaction and encounter, every single one. This is a rare combination and one from which we can all learn in our professional lives and in our personal lives. How fortunate Spelman was to have Dr. Tatum as their president. How fortunate our country is to have Dr. Tatum as a leader on race relations. How fortunate I am to consider Beverly a respected friend. And how fortunate we are today to have Dr. Tatum with us to be our keynote speaker. Please join me in welcoming the incomparable, the gracious, the humble, the brilliant Dr. Tatum.
Thank you so much, President Lieberman. I am speechless. I have to say, I don't think I've ever heard quite such a gracious and generous introduction. I'm delighted to be with you, but thank you so much for that lovely introduction.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you. And now, as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Shannon Matthews. I will be moderating the conversation. We will engage in a conversation about race and racism. I do have some questions and we'll get the conversation going, and then we will stop for question and answers from those of you who are in the audience so that you too can engage with Dr. Tatum. So with that said, Dr. Tatum, it may be obvious to some, but I would like to hear directly from you. Why are we still talking about race and its relevance today? And why is this such a hard conversation?
Well, let's start with why it's a hard conversation. And in a way, because it's such a hard conversation, it might help us understand why it's still a persistent conversation, why we still need to have it. But I'd like to start with why it's hard. And that has everything to do with the fact that we learn at an early age that we're not supposed to talk about it, that we're not supposed to engage in this conversation. In fact, just as a point of reference, I'd like everyone on this call, everyone participating virtually today, to just take a moment and think about your earliest race-related memory. It might have been something that happened at school or on a playground or in your family or at the grocery store. It could have been anything. But if you think back and say, what was my earliest race-related memory? I find that when you pose that question, most people can raise their hand and say, yes, I've thought of something. And if that's true for you, what I'd now like you to think about is how old were you at the time? I find if we were all in a room together, I would ask, raise your hand, show me your fingers. How many fingers, 5, 6, whatever the number is. People will say often that their earliest memory goes back to around the age of 5 or 6 or 7. For some people, that might not be true. Depends on where you grew up, what your social context was. For other people, they might say, well, really, I was in college, or it was later in my life when I went into the service. But for many people, it's an early childhood, elementary school age memory. And then if you ask, okay, what feeling was attached to that experience? Many people will use words like confusing. It made me feel sad. I felt embarrassed. I was ashamed. I felt guilty. I was confused. I was angry. I was anxious or afraid. Um, it's a wide range of feelings. Somebody might say, well, not me. I was happy. I was playing with a friend and noticed our differences, but it was a happy experience. But for most people, it is a more uncomfortable word that they're likely to use. And then I like to ask, okay, so maybe you were 5, 6, or 7. Maybe you had an experience that left you feeling uncomfortable or at the very least confused. Did you have a conversation with anyone at the time that it happened? An adult, a parent, a teacher, a concerned adult that you might have been able to talk to or ask questions of. Most people, if you have an audience of 112 people, as we do today, something close to that, if you ask folks to raise your hand if you did have a conversation with someone, I find that most people will say they didn't. There are always some who did, but the majority will say they did not. And if you ask further why, then you get answers like, I don't know. I'm not really sure why. There was just something about that experience. Maybe it was my parent who did or said the thing that confused me. And, I knew I wasn't supposed to ask about it. Or maybe it was just some feeling, in my gut that I knew I was supposed to be quiet about it, that maybe I'd get in trouble or that it would be more embarrassing to ask. And so a lot of people just kept it silent. And if we were in a room and had more time to talk to each other, many people would say, I've never talked to anybody. That thing I remembered, I've never told anyone about it.
Mm-hmm.
That silence is so pervasive. And I think the silence speaks to why it's still a problem, because you can't solve a problem you haven't been able to talk about. You can't do the work that's required to unpack policies and practices that are rooted in racism unless you're willing to talk about racism, unless you're willing to engage in dialogue with other people to say, where is the problem impacting our community, our school, our family, our home, our workplace? Where do we start to begin to unpack this and change it? Without having that conversation, it's hard to move forward. So I think one of the reasons we find ourselves continually having to revisit this topic, sometimes at a point of where we feel like it's a crisis, as many people felt after George Floyd's murder, or just because we know it's an ongoing problem that needs addressing. Um, I think it has everything to do with the fact that we are so reluctant to really engage in honest and authentic dialogue that might lead to the kind of constructive, productive action needed to really disrupt systems of racism in our society.
So in thinking about that, this notion of color blindness that sometimes is talked about as we talk about helping children, right, understand their world. How do you think that that discourse adds to or hinders our ability to really talk candidly about race?
I think it really hinders it, but I'll tell you why. So let me start by saying that I hear most often white parents talking about wanting their children to be colorblind. And sometimes they'll tell me, you know, my daughter, my son is colorblind. They never mention anybody else's race or ethnicity. You know, they have diverse friends, but they never talk about that aspect of their friends' experience. And what I like to say in response to that observation to that parent is to say, you know, it might not be that your child is colorblind. It might be that your child has learned to be what I call color silent, meaning that child has learned I'm not supposed to label people. I'm not supposed to, I'm not supposed to say someone's black. I'm not supposed to talk about their race or ethnicity. I'm supposed to pretend I don't notice. But in doing so, you are erasing that person's experience. You know, that individual, I'll speak for myself as a Black woman operating in the world, raising children, now all grown up. But, you know, there are things that have happened in my life that are influenced, impacted by my racial group membership. If someone says, I don't notice that about you, I don't see that about you, what they're saying is, I'm not noticing your life experience. And that doesn't feel very good. Most people want to feel seen, heard, and understood. And that includes um, the racial groups of which they're a part and the experiences that have been shaped by their social location, their race, their socioeconomic status, their language, all of those things impact how others respond to you. And if it's and as you grow increasingly comfortable, as adolescents are claiming their identities, as those identities become more central to how you think about yourself, the more important it is to you to have those identities acknowledged.
So in your TED Talk, you kind of addressed how we would then, what some tips might be for talking with children about that. And some of our students expressed wanting to hear directly from you a few tips in regards to some of what you mentioned in your TED Talk about my skin is brown, but is my skin brown because I drank chocolate milk? So can you just share a couple of tips you would give to parents who might want to help develop children who are more culturally aware?
Sure. Well, let's start with very young children. People often say, well, when should you start having conversations with children about difference? And I'm using the word difference as opposed to race because I think it's important to acknowledge that race is an artificial construct. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is one category, human being, right? The human race. Biologists tell us today, we now know, maybe we didn't know this in the 18th or the 19th century or even part of the 20th century, but in the 21st century, we know that there's more genetic similarity across people, even if they look very different, then there are differences. And in fact, you know, you could have two Black people standing next to each other. They might be more different in terms of their DNA than one of those Black people standing next to a white person. They might be more, those two people, even though they look different on the outside, might actually be genetically more similar. We can't, the genetic material that determines our physical appearance is such a small percentage of the whole DNA package that these these categories that we use are really not biologically relevant. But we do know that they're socially relevant, right? We do know that if you've got dark skin or I'm thinking about not just skin, but hair texture or eye shape or, all the things that we see as physical markers of difference. Those characteristics may well influence how people respond to you. But so I am trying to stop using personally. I am working on using, instead of the word race, talking about racial categories, right, or racial groups, because these are socially constructed categories. But having said all of that, what I want to say relative to young children, they don't know those labels, right? A 2-year-old doesn't know that label, but a 2-year-old notices brown skin, darker or lighter than their own, right? So a white child in a preschool or a daycare setting is going to notice, Tommy's skin is light, David's skin is brown. They're going to notice that difference. They're going to notice Tina's hair is straight, Susie's hair is curly. They're going to notice those differences and they may ask about them. Parents can talk about those differences in a very natural way and do it in a way that affirms the value of straight and curly, light and dark. That what we know when we think about racism is fundamentally built on assumptions of value, that some people are more valuable than other people. Some appearances are more valued than others. That's how racism functions in our society. If parents want to raise their children to be anti-racist, then what they need to do is start introducing an understanding of difference in a way that values all shapes and sizes, right? All shades and colors. And so you can do that. If you live in an all-white neighborhood, it's going to be hard to have those conversations because your child's not necessarily going to encounter people whose racial categories are different than their own. But you can do it through books. You can do it through media. Increasingly, children's television, whether that's Sesame Workshop or Nick Jr. or Noggin, there's all kinds of programs that are really thinking about how to introduce children to an understanding of the diversity of human beings in ways that are affirming of that difference. And beginning to have those conversations is something that parents, babysitters, siblings can do from a very early age. But kids will ask questions. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't bring it up, they will. And so it is important to be able to feel comfortable when that question comes. Tommy says my skin is brown because I drank chocolate milk. Is that true? That's the question my son brought to me. And I could say, no, it's not true. And explain your skin is brown because you have something in your skin called melanin. Everybody has some. The more you have, the browner your skin is. It helps protect your skin from the sun, I said. And, that's the answer. You can tell that to a 3-year-old, and a 3-year-old will understand that. And even Tommy, who asked the question, has melanin in his skin too, just not as much as you do, which is why his skin is lighter.
Right. So now let's shift a little bit to higher education and our difficulty with conversations around race. Do you think the current focus and emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion within higher ed and other industries right now mirrors some of the conversations and discussions we had in the 1960s around affirmative action? And then what impact do you think the push for diversity, equity, and inclusion will really have on institutions?
Well, I want to take us back, if I could, to 1954. Let's
Okay.
start there, okay? And you might say, why 1954? One reason is because it was the year of Brown versus Board of Education, right? That Supreme Court ruling, which basically ruled unconstitutional legally segregated schools. But another reason why I like to start with 1954 is because it's the year that I was born. And so, having said that, I think it's important to situate ourselves historically so we know when we're making progress or not, right? So, this is a personal anecdote. When I was born in 1954, my family lived in Florida. I was born in Florida, in the Jim Crow South. My father was a professor, and he taught art at Florida A&M, which is a historically Black institution. Both he and my mom went to Howard University and HBCU, and then my dad, who majored in art as an undergrad, got a master's degree in art from the University of Iowa in the early 50s, and then he started teaching at Florida A&M. Now, in order to advance in higher education, probably all the students know, it helps to have a doctorate. You know, you need to earn that doctorate. And so my father wanted to earn his doctorate and would have liked to do that at Florida State University, which is in the same city, Tallahassee, Florida, as Florida A&M. That would have been very convenient. However, in 1954, it was not possible for him as an African American man to attend Florida State, which was a whites only institution. Even after Brown versus Board of Education outlawed legalized segregation, the southern states were slow to undo those practices. But the way that the state of Florida and other southern states, it wasn't just Florida that did this, accommodated someone like my dad who wanted to study art education at a graduate level. Rather than let him go to Florida State across town, they paid his transportation out of state, and he attended Penn State. He got his degree from Penn State, commuting back and forth between Florida and Pennsylvania. Now, the state of Florida didn't pay his tuition at Penn State, but they did reimburse him for his train fare. When I tell people that story, it sounds crazy today, you know, that a state would behave in that way. But that was how it was, right? That's how it was. So when we talk about affirmative action in the 60s, when President Lyndon B. Johnson first used that term, affirmative action, and what was required to undo the past damage caused by policies like that, he started talking about that in 1965. So at that time, I think Florida State was still pretty much a whites only institution. I think it was maybe 1966 or 67 that they first admitted, I could be wrong on the date, but it was in the 60s that they first admitted Black students to Florida State. So this is to say that when we first started talking about affirmative action, we were really talking about policies and practices intended to undo decades of past discrimination. Those affirmative action programs were put into place in the early 60s through the 70s, but started to be legally challenged in the late 70s and into the 80s and beyond. And as progress was being made, access to opportunity was expanding, there was pushback against that progress. Mm-hmm. Dr. King, in his last book, wrote, the last book is called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? One of the things that he says in his book is after every period of racial progress, there has been pushback against that progress. And if we think about the progress that happened with the first round of affirmative action, and then we look at the policies, like in California, you know, laws passed to say no more affirmative action, right? Propositions saying you can't consider race at all in state-related programs, whether those are education programs or employment programs. If they're funded by the state, no affirmative action. And that pushback against that progress has led to some loss of gains. I think it's pretty easy to measure. Fast forward, some people would say the election of President Barack Obama in 2008 was a marker of a period of progress, culminating in his election. You know, more people being able to vote, more people having access to education, all of that culminating in his election. But then some people would argue, I might be one of those people, that from 2008 to today, that 13-year period from 2008 to 2021, there's been pushback against that progress. And you've seen that pushback in terms of more laws restricting access to the vote, particularly in states where there are high populations of Black and brown voters. You have seen, again, retrenchment relative to affirmative action in higher education in a lot of settings. But now we are starting following the George Floyd, I'm going to call it crisis, the George Floyd murder and the summer of racial reckoning and the protests that came along with that. Many organizations, higher ed and private companies, are saying we need to be really looking at our policies, our practices. We need to do more hiring. We really need to get our act together around becoming anti-racist organizations. And there's a new push. And I think it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We, you know, today in 2021, are we where we were in 1954? We are not, right? We are in a different place. We have never regressed back to 1954. But we've seen some backward motion, and now we're moving forward again. And I can expect, I hope it won't be the case, that as we see progress and companies making commitments, there will be a segment of the population that pushes back against that. And that's just part of the way progress moves forward. It's not linear, straight ahead, no interruptions. It's, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I do think we're at a time when people are ready to push forward. And I think we should seize the opportunity.
So what place then does race and issues of inclusion have in the classroom? And I say that because we got a comment from a student that says, how can intersectionality be introduced to students who are younger because their first experience with it has been in graduate school and they see the value for their discipline?
Yeah, well, these are ideas that could be introduced in middle school. In fact, I've known teachers who have been able to successfully talk to kids even in upper elementary school to help them understand how racism operates in our society and what they can do to be change agents. So there's no reason to wait till graduate school to have a conversation about these issues or to talk about them. We need to think about, you know, the particular term that was used in the question was intersectionality. And I think it's important to acknowledge that whenever we're talking about an ism, in this case, racism, we have to take into consideration the other isms that are attached to people's experience. So as a Black woman, I may have firsthand experience with racism, but I also have firsthand experience with sexism. And my experience of racism as a Black woman is going to be different than a Black man's experience of racism. We may both experience racism, but it's going to be mediated by gender, right? And there are other identities that will have an impact. You know, we often talk, we meaning individuals, me too, often talk about those identities where we feel targeted. You've heard me mention racism and sexism, but I can talk about those identities where I am part of the dominant group as a heterosexual relative to heterosexism, as a Christian relative to a pro-Christian, anti-Semitic context, right? You know, that I'm not subject to anti-Semitism because of my Christian identity. I'm not subject to heterosexism or homophobia because of my heterosexual identity. Or ableism, I'm not subject to the negative impacts of ableism because I don't suffer a disability. I grew up in a socioeconomically middle-class family, child of a college professor. I didn't have the negative impacts of poverty that also mediate the experience of racism and the other isms. I didn't, even as we talk about racism and I talk about my experience as an African American woman, I'm a light skinned African American woman. And that is a different experience than if I had been born a dark skinned person, because colorism is another factor in terms of how racism operates. So when we think about any particular ism, we have to look at it through the prism, but the overlaying influences of those other identities.
Thank you. I think now we're going to shift a little bit and open up the floor for question and answers to give ample time there. If needed, I do have a few more questions I can present as well, but I want to go ahead and open up the floor. So those of you who are here, if you want to put anything in the chat or you want to raise your hand, please feel free at this time to share a question. So as they're gearing up to do that, and Kristen, if you can help me keep an eye out, Beverly, I do have a few more questions that the students raised. Yes, and so I will insert that and be keeping an eye on the chat so that way we can also add audience questions as well. So you've talked before about racism really around being a systematic privilege. And yeah, I've heard you talk before also about the need to disrupt that. So when we think about the Super Bowl just passed, and we think about Colin Kaepernick, or we think about the NBA finals and the stance that professional athletes took to use their platform, is this the kind of disruption you think that adds to our better understanding of racism, or what do you think that impact is?
Let me start by saying, let's talk a little bit about our terminology. How about that? If we spend just a moment talking about our terminology. So when we think about, one of the things that makes it hard to have these conversations is that we're not all using language in the same way. And so I find that it is helpful to just take a minute to define some terms. So for example, prejudice. We all have prejudices. What's a prejudice? A prejudice is an attitude about people different from yourself, or even people like yourself, but an attitude that is based usually on limited information, often based on stereotypes. And when we talk about prejudice, I like to say we all have some. None of us grows up escaping the influence about prejudice, right? Because it's like smog in the air, the misinformation that we are exposed to through media, through conversations, through the language we hear people use, all of that stuff shapes our view of the world, and particularly influences how we think about those groups of people with whom we have limited experience. Okay, so when we think about racial prejudice, some people use racial prejudice and racism interchangeably. Racism, however, is more than just racial prejudice. It's not just somebody's individual attitudes. It's also about policies and practices that have shaped our interactions in the world. You know, if there's a policy that says some people can vote and other people can't, that's not just about somebody's individual attitude. It impacts how resources are being divided as a consequence of an election, for example. If someone doesn't have access to housing because of discrimination, it's not just somebody's individual attitude, it is impacting policies and practices around where somebody can live and where they have access to work and the kinds of schools they'll be able to go to, all of that. So when we think about racism, what we have to understand is that it's more than just attitudes or somebody being nice or not nice to somebody else. It's about policies and practices and procedures that are really baked into our society that systematically advantage one group over others. So how do we disrupt that? You know, when someone like Colin Kaepernick says, I'm gonna kneel instead of stand because I want to bring attention to an important social issue that I'm concerned about. In this case, disparate police violence as directed toward Black people, and Black men in particular, but Black people in general. When he wants to draw attention to that, those injustices, and he's using his visibility as an athlete and as a activist, he's making that visible, and that's using, as I would say, it's using his sphere of influence. Now, there are people who will say, well, that's not the place to use your sphere of influence. Use it someplace else. But in fact, he is doing something that is nonviolent and not disruptive. He's not interrupting anybody else's right to sit or stand or pledge allegiance or sing the anthem. He is, in his own quiet way, that's what he was doing. Now, we all know that he paid a price for that, essentially locked out of his career as the NFL quarterback. But that said, he was doing what any one of us can do in our own sphere of influence. Because he's a celebrity, he has a big platform, but everyone, including everyone listening to the sound of my voice in this conversation, influences other people, whether that's family members or classmates or colleagues or people at your church or in your neighborhood. We all influence or have the opportunity to influence other people. And if we are concerned about a social issue, we have the opportunity to use that influence to educate others, to talk about it, to raise awareness. And so it's something that we all should be thinking about. How do I use my platform? How do I make sure that what I'm learning about and care about relative to social justice issues like racism are being made more visible through the influence that I have?
So we do have a couple of questions coming in the chat, and so I'm going to raise those now. One question was, how do we navigate the divide between race and ethnicity and broach that conversation?
Sure. Well, again, it comes back to definitions, right? So I talked a little bit about the fact that these racial categories that we use, Black, white, Asian, indigenous, they're not biologically meaningful, but they are culturally significant because of the experiences people have had. But when we talk about ethnicity, we are often talking about language. We're talking about cultural dimensions like language, geographic place of origin, religious identities. Think about the things that make up culture: food and language and religious beliefs and cultural patterns. And you can identify ethnically with a group and also claim a racial identity, and someone of the same ethnic group might claim a different racial identity. For example, Cuban. Someone might say, my family's from Cuba. I identify as being Cuban. That's my ethnic identity. I speak Spanish, or my family spoke Spanish, and the Cuban foods that are common are part of our cultural experience, and, all the things that we think of associated with ethnicity. But physically, a person might have light skin and straight hair and be identified as white, and might even claim that as their racial identity. Yes, I'm Cuban. I identify as white because of my physical appearance and how people respond to me. Someone from the same family or a distant relative could say, I too am Cuban, and I share in common that language and that food and that religious culture and all of those things, but my skin is dark and people respond to me as a Black person, and I claim my racial identity, my racial group membership as Black.
Yeah. So oftentimes we have to allow people opportunities to explain to us self-identification, how they identify, which warrants a conversation, which is something you're always advocating for.
Yes.
So there's one question in the chat that said you wrote about why Black kids sit at the same table in the, in the cafeteria. The question is, why are they still sitting at the same table in the same groups in college?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about why they're there in the first place. So let's imagine that you are growing up in a racially mixed community, and but it's a predominantly white community. I'm going to make it a predominantly white community in this example. So racially mixed but predominantly white community, and you go to an elementary school, and that elementary school is goes from K through 8. Some schools go K through 5, and then there's a middle school, 6 through 8, and then there's high school. But let's imagine in this case, this school is going from kindergarten through 8th grade. And the reason I'm using this as my example is that if you started in kindergarten and went all the way through the 8th grade, it's the same kids. And the same kids who started together as kindergartners in first grade are mixing together, in second grade are mixing together, in third grade are mixing together. But maybe by the time they get to the 5th grade or the 6th grade, certainly by the time they're in the 7th or 8th grade, they have started to separate out along racial lines. We might say, well, why is that? It's the same kids. Why would that kind of separation happen? Here's one answer to that question. One answer to that question is that as you approach puberty, and for some kids, that's as early as 4th or 5th grade, we know that children, maybe because of the American diet, are reaching puberty at an earlier age. And so maybe as early as 4th or 5th, certainly by 6th grade, kids are starting to develop into their adolescent bodies, and they're starting to develop their adolescent brains. And what does that mean? As the brain develops, as you age, you're starting to be able to think more abstractly, more symbolically, and you start asking yourself questions like, who am I? How do I fit in this world? How do other people see me? And as you start to take on that adolescent body, more adult-like in your appearance, people respond to you differently. So the African-American boy who everybody thought was cute when he was 6, now that he's 12 and maybe approaching 6 feet tall, is viewed as potentially a threat or dangerous. He's not seen in the same way. And as the response of the adults around him shift, he starts to think about, what does this mean for me and who I am and how do I deal with the world? And the racism in the environment starts to impact him more directly. He's out on his own. He's not always with his parents. He's, interfacing with the police who are following him around, or being followed in the store, suspected of shoplifting, or whatever it might be. And the more experiences he's having or she's having with those experiences that remind you of your racial category, the more you're going to seek out people who understand what that feels like. The more you're going to seek out people who know what you're experiencing. Let's imagine something, though. Let's imagine you're in the 6th grade and you have an encounter with a teacher. This is a true story. It's in my book, and it's an example that I use, but I think it makes up the point. Let's imagine it's the 6th grade. You're at the school, and a white teacher is encouraging you to participate in an after-school activity. Maybe there's going to be the 6th grade dance or something. And you don't usually go, maybe because you have transportation issues, you need to get home, whatever your reasons are. The teacher's trying to encourage you to participate. Nothing wrong with that. But when the teacher gets frustrated because you keep saying, no, I'm not going. He's talking to a young Black girl. She keeps saying, no, I'm not going. Then he says to her, oh, come on. I know you people love to dance. Now, when she hears that, she recognizes it as a stereotype, right? He is, again, not trying to be mean, but he has taken in some stereotypical information and he has projected it onto her, and she's offended. Now let's imagine she's walking away from that interaction with that teacher. I'm going to call that teacher Mr. Smith. And she's walking away from Mr. Smith, and she runs into a white girl who is her longtime friend since they were kindergartners. And that friend asks her, "What's wrong? Why do you look so upset?" And she tells the story of what just happened with Mr. Smith. And that friend says to her, "Oh, come on, he didn't mean any harm. You know, you're being oversensitive." Now, that girl is not only upset with Mr. Smith, but she's upset with her friend too, because she feels like you don't get me. You don't get how I'm feeling about this. But it might have been a different interaction if her friend had said, "I can't believe he played that stereotype with you. I can see why you're upset. Let's go have lunch." The two of them will go off together. She's feeling heard. She's feeling understood in that interaction. But in part, she's going to keep walking away from that friend because the friend didn't get it. She's going to bump into maybe another Black girl who's going to say, "Why are you so upset?" She's going to explain what happened. And that friend is going to say, "I can't believe it. He did the same thing to me yesterday." Now the two of them are sitting together in the cafeteria. You see how that works? It's not just about seeking out comfort with people who are like you. And there's always that kind of comfort, and all of us seek it out. But it's also about who understands my experience. And if my white friends were more able to talk about racism with me, more able to connect rather than deny my experience, maybe they're too busy trying to be colorblind, then maybe I would have been able to have lunch with both of those young women. You see where I'm going here in terms of really trying to recognize that it's not just what's going on with the kids of color, it's also what's not going on with the white kids, that they're not learning how to make those connections.
Okay. And Dr. Cummings has her hand up. Kristen, can you help, or can she unmute herself? There you go.
Here I am. Thank you. And really, this is such an important conversation. A question and observation. So a student asked a question, how do you feel less victimized? And my question kind of goes along with that. I was showing my students a documentary film the other week dealing with social movements and protest. And it was very recent. And it had Black Lives Matter in there. It had a lot of political stuff. And in the chat, some students said, "I'm experiencing PTSD." And the other students said, "Yeah, so am I." So I brought it up after the film and I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because this is so recent. This is what we've gone through in the last 4 years." And so given that these issues really are painful,
Yeah.
a lot of students, how do you have a discussion in class, taking that into consideration? And then along with the student who asked, how do you feel less victimized? Because they're talking about you, and sometimes you're the only one in the room who fits whatever the issue is.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to be the only one in the room. So I want to come back to that particular challenge and how the instructor, the faculty member can help mitigate the negative impact of being the only one in the room, being the sort of the token representative of the targeted group. But I think it's important to be able to talk about recent history, current events as part of the curriculum, particularly in classes where that makes sense. If I was teaching psychology of racism, certainly I wouldn't want to just talk about racism in the past. We want to talk about what's happening today. But I think what helps people feel less triggered by that is to the extent that we can talk about how we can change, how we can bring about change. It is hard to watch those videos. It is hard to even read that history. It is hard to visualize that George Floyd murder. All of that is painful. And yet, how can we translate our pain into proactive activity that brings about change? And sometimes learning about examples of communities that have been able to do that. whether that's, new policing policies that are going in place, or, I live in Georgia. Maybe it's about, voter suppression being overcome and then turning into 2 cent victories as a consequence of really battling against that voter suppression. So that is, the empowered response to issues of social justice, I think, helps people when they can see examples of success, even if that success comes after struggle, but the fact that progress is possible and change can happen. That's sort of my mantra: change can happen. And so, but in the case of, you're the only Black student in the class, or the only targeted student, whatever the group might be, um, in the class, and so there's a dynamic that anyone who's ever been in that role knows. When, the subject comes up and everyone sort of turns and looks at you, waiting to see what's your reaction, what do you have to say? And certainly the less confident you are, the more likely you are to want to just sort of slide under the desk, or, stop your video if you're on Zoom, or whatever it might be. But the reality is that the instructor, one of the things that an instructor can do at the beginning is to say, we're going to be talking about issues related to, let's say, racism. And this is a conversation in which we really need multiple voices. Unfortunately, we don't have the range of voices in our class that we would like to have. It's important for all of us to remember that none of us speaks for a group. Each of us is an individual. We can only speak for ourselves and our own experiences. And to kind of normalize that, and then also to shift the focus sometimes. We want to, if we're talking about protests, or we're talking about recent events, let's say the murder of George Floyd, to just use an example that many of us will recognize. Of course, there's a question of how does that make you feel as the person under the knee, but how does it make you feel as the person kneeling? How do we think about, what is the white response to that? How does that, shifting the conversation to put more responsibility for talking about these issues away from those who are targeted by them, and more toward those who we would like to evolve their ability to be upstanders or allies, as we say. But I think finding a way to bring the absent voices into the room, whether that's through video, through visitors, community leaders who can be invited into the classroom, or other kinds of things, can help with that sense of being the only one. I have found that to be useful too. And to sometimes have a sidebar conversation with that student to say, I know this can be challenging. This is a challenging situation. I've been in it myself. I know it can be challenging. What would be helpful to you?
Yes. So in relation to that, how does the study of race and racism help us shape the ways we understand issues of human rights?
Well, racism is a human, we're talking about, how can I say this? If we understand racism as essentially about a hierarchy of human value, right? If we understand the idea of white supremacy as essentially a belief system that says some people are more valuable than other people, people who are light-skinned and of European ancestry are the ones who should be in charge of the people who are darker skinned from other parts of the world. That fundamentally is the core idea of white supremacy. That human rights are about the fact that all of us are human and we all have rights. And therefore, there should be no hierarchy of human value, that's a flawed ideology. So racism is one example of that flawed ideology, but in the same way, we could talk about other isms, whether anti-Semitism, there's a hierarchy of religious belief. If you're at this point in that religious belief, then you're more valuable than someone who's not. Same with sexual orientation. Same with all of the isms operate in that way, where there's a favored group that is seen as more valuable, more worthy, more desirable in some important dimensions than others. So if we understand that those ideas are contradictory to the concept of human rights, then we know that all of them are a problem. And as I like to say, choose your own adventure. Where do you want to start your work? For me, it has been around racism, but always understanding that racism is not the only ism. And as we talked about before, intersectionality means we have to recognize the ways in which any one ism is mediated by the others.
So now it's been 20 years since that first book that really kind of introduced your thoughts and ideas.
Yes.
And there's been a lot going on more recently with regard to race, racism, and a lot of isms. So when you think about the next 20 years, what do you think or would like to see in our progress?
So, it's so interesting to hear you. First of all, let me just say, I do not plan to write another version 20 years from now. Let's just be clear on that point.
Okay.
But having said that, I think a lot about Dr. King's last book. I made reference to it earlier, but I want to mention it again. The title of that book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, is a really interesting example because it was published in 1968, just before his assassination. And, that was 52 years ago. But if you read it, it sounds a lot like he's describing problems that are still with us today. And at the very end of the book, he asks a question. And the question is perhaps a good one for us to end this portion of our conversation on, because he asks the question and says it's up to us to decide whether we want chaos or community, whether we want to choose chaos or community. And I think a lot about that in this particular moment, of February 2021, in the first 6 weeks of the year 2021, we have seen some chaos. Yeah. And we all have to decide whether that's what we're interested in, chaos, or whether we want to work for community. I think that even as we've seen chaos, we've also heard a vision of what community could be like. I'm thinking right this moment about that powerful poem read by the poet Amanda Gorman at the inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris. And the closing lines of her poem, she says something, I think I'm going to be able to recite it because I think it's such a powerful set of lines, but she says something like, "There's always light if we are brave enough to see it, if we are brave enough to be it." And I think that if we want to be the light that pushes for change, that pushes for community, 20 years from now, we will be happy we did. But if we don't, we are likely to not see as much light as we hope for. And unfortunately, more chaos than we can stand. So I hope that we will all look for the light and choose to be it.
I just want, on behalf of the La Verne community, to say thank you so much. We have had an honorable conversation with you, and we love having you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.